Today, where we're headed in terms of a roadmap is what do I mean by a Mediterranean type ecosystem? And what do we have in common with other Mediterranean ecosystems around the globe? The TBC3 story, how we went from evaluating climate threats to actually helping to shape and form adaptation opportunities with our partners. And what are climate smart landscape strategies? I'm going to show you some examples. We have a lot of other presentations that get into the science, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what people are doing around the globe for climate resilience. And then how can we bring what we're learning and sharing home at a very local scale, talking about just working with our neighbors in the Knights Valley next door to Pepperwood. Having laid out that roadmap, I'm going to take a detour. You know, as an earth scientist and as a long-term sentinel site for our region, we like to take a very long-range view and think about large scales and large time scales. However, like many of you, this morning, what was the first thing I did when I woke up? I had to wake up and check the fire maps in our area. And so here you can see the region that Pepperwood serves, ranging from Monterey to Mendocino counties, and just what the fire activity looks like today. So why does large landscape conservation matter? And I want to just relate it to what's going on this morning. You know, these fires don't know when they cross the county line from Napa to Sonoma. They are part of a process of landscape evolution and ecosystem change over time. So on the left-hand side, I've zoomed in to just the North Bay area. You can see Highway 37 at the very bottom and Clear Lake in the middle. And if you look over to the right, that's today's fires in the context of the fires that have just happened in the last few years. So this is the domain within which Pepperwood does its research and does its collaborations with the park districts, the fire districts, the water districts, county planners. You know, how do we understand the processes in this region and how climate change is affecting us? And since our threats don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, our strategies also need to transcend them. So I will just tell you, I had so many different projects I wanted to highlight today that we're involved with in this region. So there's a lot more under the surface, but I'm going to try to give you a flavor of the work we're doing and why we're doing it and how we can work together to increase our resilience to risks like wildfires. So back to my main outline, starting with what is a Mediterranean type ecosystem. So here's a really cool visualization of the Mediterranean basin. This is where my ancestors hailed from. I think many people who've studied classical history see this as the region where a lot of Western civilization was formed, how we create governance structures, how we build cities, and how we tap into our natural resources in this region. And of course, for millennia, this is a region that's been really important for food production as well. And some of our favorite cultural developments, such as making wine and growing olives and making incredible bread, for example. So when we speak to Mediterranean type ecosystems, we're talking about other areas of the world as well that possess a similar kind of climatic pattern to that Mediterranean region. And you can see most of these areas that are in California, the central portion of Chile, western South Africa, and the western and southern parts of South Australia. These generally occur within a similar latitude, 30 to 45 degrees, either north or south latitude. So they have quite a bit in common in terms of their position on the planet. I'm going to walk you through this slide, so don't get overwhelmed. But when I think about a Mediterranean type ecosystem, and again, I'm a physical earth scientist, I look at the planet through the lens of physical processes, in particular water. But what's interesting about Mediterranean type ecosystems, and they all have in common, is that they have very wet winters and then essentially dry summers. almost no rain during the summer. So I know that's very familiar to us in California. Once I was teaching a hydrology class for the junior college, and I had a student come up to me afterwards and he said, "Do you mean there's actually places where it does rain during the summer?" So, you know, we are adapted to this ecosystem, but it's pretty distinctive. And when you look at this graph, and I don't know, Margaret, can you tell me if people can see my pointer?
Yes, we can see
Okay,
your
good.
pointer, Lisa.
So this light blue line is showing you rainfall, the amount of rainfall that happens each month over the year. We're starting with October, which is what hydrologists consider the beginning of the water year. And so you can see the rainfall start in October. We get our wettest storms generally between December and February. The rainfall peters off towards the springtime, and then we go into our super dry summer. What this watershed diagram is showing you, and this is a TBC3 product that we developed to understand our local climate, we're showing you in yellow how the water is accumulating in the soils. So in a Mediterranean ecosystem, this water that goes into the soil profile is really the reservoir for plants, animals, and even our aquifers and streams. The dark blue is the water that sinks into the ground. This is recharging our aquifers and going deeper than just the soils layer. That teeny tiny royal blue slice is the water that runs off the surface. And this is generally what people think of as our water supply. But one point I want to make of this slide is how important the water under the ground is. But that little teeny slice is what we have available to fill our reservoirs. And then the green slice is showing you what the plants are using over the course of the year. So during the beginning time in the fall, there's not a lot of plant activity, but as the spring cranks up, they're using up that water, which produces this red bubble at the end. And this red bubble is something we call the climatic water deficit. This red bubble is showing you how much more water the plants wish they had. It's the deficit between what's available in the soils for them to use and what they have. And so this red blob is a really great indicator in the end of where plants might be stressed by drought, where plants could die off due to that drought, and where the fire risks may be the highest. So we are finding that this water deficit is a great predictor of fuel moisture, which in turn is an important indicator of fire probability. So what's the impact of climate change on this watershed balance? It's going to increase the water deficits and decrease the water that's available to go into the other parts of this diagram. So in a water limited environment, like a Mediterranean type ecosystem, climate change is making us more arid. And the tools that we've developed at TBC3 let us quantify that aridity and share it with water managers, agricultural partners, and folks managing our natural resources and biodiversity. This is the link here is where you can go find it. If you just look for the TBC3 Bay Area Watershed Analyst, you can find it. And you can ask a question about your own watershed, what this picture looks like and how it might change in the future and how it operated in the past. But the other thing about Mediterranean type ecosystems is that we tend to experience heavy winter storms. So I've shown here in the upper left, this is a map of water vapor in the atmosphere. And you may have heard of the term atmospheric river. Slang for the one that hits us up here is the Pineapple Express, because it's about water vapor that collects in Hawaii and then forms a river basically in the sky. This river can carry many times the volume of the Amazon River. And it's the interaction of these water vapor plumes with local mountains that create our rainfall. And so in Sonoma County, we estimate that 60 or 70% of our water supply comes from these big winter storms. And they're very hard to predict when they're going to hit us. And as you can see, the patterns in the sky show you how it's meandering. So it's these things move very swiftly. And that's why it's so hard for the weatherman to tell us exactly where and how much rain is going to fall. But this is a common pattern in most Mediterranean areas where they're receiving some wet air flows, and it's what we call an orographic effect of being forced over the mountainous landscape that helps the water to drop out. So one of the things I say about Mediterranean climates is we always have too little and too much water, right? We're prone to flash floods, and there is an indication that as the planet gets warmer and stormier, there could be more variability in these storms. And we don't know if that means in the long run we're going to get more water or less water, but we know it's going to be more variable. And then one of the really cool things, if you get a chance to travel in these other regions, is how similar the landscape looks to California. So in the upper right-hand side, you're seeing a shot of Northern California, and the lower right-hand side is central Chile. So we have a research partnership with Patricio Pliskov and his laboratory at the Universidad Católica de Santiago. And Pato's lab, including his grad student, Taryn Fuentes Castillo, has been working with David Ackerley, who's one of our visiting scholars and actually also the TBC3 co-chair. And we're doing a comparison of the kinds of vegetation that occur in both places. And what's interesting is that the species are very different and not necessarily related, but functionally they're very compatible, or comparable, I should say. And so they're studying the distribution of these plants over climatic gradients in both countries, and then assessing how might these plants rearrange themselves as the climate changes, and where are you likely to see the bigger changes. This is a research project that we were planning to present next month, September, in Cape Town, South Africa, at the Mediterranean Ecosystem World Congress, which is called Medicos. And most of the international colleagues I'll show today are folks that I met in the context of planning a Fulbright research project around this theme. And we have a panel planned for September this year, which has been bumped to 2021. We'll see how that goes, but the really cool thing is, even without being able to travel and see each other, we're able to carry on this partnership virtually and share it with you all. And then lastly, Mediterranean type ecosystems are fire prone and have a history of fire management in almost every place you go, whether it's indigenous people or early agricultural settlers. So this is a view of Pepperwood during the 2019 Kincaid fire. As many of you know, most of the preserve was burned in 2017, and then we were revisited in 2019 by the Kincaid fire. And now we're holding our breath as we have fires both to the west and east of us burning in Napa and the western parts of Sonoma County. So we're definitely seeing a trend towards larger fires and potentially more damaging fires. And Morgan Gray did an analysis on our team that 75% of the largest fires have occurred since 2000. So these are the events people are starting to call mega fires. And it's a combination of factors that we'll talk a little bit more about, but definitely climate change is increasing the aridity of the landscape and increasing the probability of fire, and also a factor that's impacting the timing of fire, that our fire season is starting earlier than normal or historically. And then lastly, Mediterranean ecosystems, because they're such agriculturally productive lands, tend to be the heartland of each country that they're in. So on the upper left, I've got Knights Valley showing this incredible vineyard that's neighboring Pepperwood. On the lower right-hand side is Catalonia, Spain, where I've got to spend some time, where they grow a lot of wheat and also grapes as well. So a lot of the landscape in Mediterranean ecosystems are converted from natural habitat to agriculture. And they're still very thriving ecosystems as this melange of working and protected areas. But it also means that compared to, say, the rainforest or other kinds of ecosystems, there's a much lower level of protection in those areas. There's fewer parks, there's fewer set-aside areas like Pepperwood. And so, you know, you've got biodiversity that's second only to rainforests, but a much lower focus on the conservation and stewardship of these landscapes. But I think we have a real opportunity to work with our agricultural partners and maintain the health of this landscape. So the TBC3 story, we were so lucky the month that we opened the Dwight Center for Conservation Science. We were the recipients of a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation's Bay Area program had invested at that point about $2 billion into the lands of the Bay Area to increase the protected areas and set them aside. And what they were hearing from the stewards of those lands is that they had absolutely no idea how to respond to climate change, how to understand the impacts that climate change were going to have on their lands, and then the next step to think about how they could respond. So they asked David Ackerley, who's I think the tallest fellow in that photo, to pull together a team of different scientists, and David had established himself as an expert on the relationship between climate change and the future of California's native vegetation. And he pulled together a team that included water specialists, geospatial analysts, meteorologists, obviously all climate change scientists, wildlife ecologists. And what we did was put our disciplines together to come up with an integrated picture of the history of climate change in the Bay Area and how the future will be affected. And we were very much focused on the outset on the Conservation Lands Network of the Bay Area Open Space Council, which was setting priorities for conservation across all the Bay Area counties. So we created what we call a climate adaptation knowledge base. And this is a series of maps, essentially, that are quantitative, that show the climate and how it relates to the topography of the area. And one of the aspects of our mountainous area and this coastal margin is that the interaction of the near surface meteorology and that topography creates effects that we call topoclimate. You could also think of it as microclimates. And that really controls where the water occurs in the landscape. In response to that distribution of temperature and water in the landscape, you can project where vegetation can live and how that vegetation might change over time. And then in turn, what are the fire risks associated with that land cover? And then lastly, the ecologists can take that projection about the habitat and how it's going to change over time, and then look at individual species or think about how groups of species are going to be able to utilize habitats, or how perhaps their habitat is going to shift in locations over time. And how can we protect areas not just for what lives there today, but what will be able to live there tomorrow. And this is not just one set of projections. We actually made 20 projections for this region that reflect the full variability of the 100+ models that have been generated by the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the gold bar, I would say, or gold star of climate work for the globe. So taking global models and making them very relevant locally. One of the things we realized when we did this, however, is that we weren't just looking at threats or how things might be degraded, but that we actually had information that could be used to develop adaptation strategies. And by mapping where the water is and mapping where potential refugia are for species, we could actually inform ways to move forward. So I want to talk about some of those strategies that are emerging and how they're playing out both in California and with our international partners. I'll also just remind you that Pepperwood itself is a living laboratory for TBC3, where we're looking at the relationship of all these factors and able to collect data in real time every 15 minutes. In some cases, we're collecting these attributes so that the hypotheses the scientists have in the TBC3 community and the hypotheses we're using to generate maps for all of California can be validated with data collected at Pepperwood and elsewhere. And we are working right now with the State of California's Natural Resources Agency to think about how this Sentinel site can be expanded not just from Pepperwood, but to multiple sites across California, so we have comparable high quality data to share. I'll also say in the last 5 years in particular, due to our partnerships with public agencies, the value of this real-time data collection is being seen as critical for improving situational awareness for our first responders for emergencies. So we're now hosting thanks to the Sonoma Water Agency, an emergency flood warning gauge that's part of a network of gauges. And then we were the first ones to install fire cameras in the North Bay Alert Wildfire network. And those fire cameras have been such a game changer. I'm hearing from so many people in our community right now that the ability to get very accurate information about where the fires are and how they're behaving is not only improving our first responders' response in terms of CAL FIRE and fire departments, but it's also really giving people peace of mind that they can go to the alertwildfire.org website and see exactly what's going on for themselves to inform how they're going to respond and take care of their families. So we've brought that work together, and I would say in the last 6 or 7 years, TBC3 has been called in after we made this big data set to actually help people think about climate adaptation strategies at multiple scales. So obviously we're working on the adaptation of our own property at the scale of the preserve. We've worked for the 3 counties of Napa, Sonoma, and Marin to look at both park management, vegetation management, and water management strategies, including the whole Russian River Basin. We're working with the Golden Gate Biosphere right now on a similar strategy. And we've also worked at the scale of the North Coast Resource Partnership, which is the right-hand map, which are all the counties from Sonoma County to the California-Oregon border that border the coast. So just giving you a sense of how we can sort of zoom in and zoom out with this information to develop practical strategies. And I think with that, before I go into some of the case studies, this would be a great time, Margaret, if people have any questions about any of the things I've raised. I know sometimes I go into jargon mode and people may want some definitions clarified.
No, that's great. And, you know, you've covered a lot of territory so far. We've got sort of a small group, so if anyone wants to talk, I have the power to allow you to talk if you want to use your voice instead of using the chat. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen and toggle on the lower bar, if you go all the way to the right, there's an opportunity to click on participants and you can raise your hand, or if you prefer, you can go ahead and write a question for Lisa in the chat box, which is also at the bottom. You kind of need to toggle over the bar to activate it. So we'll just give it a minute and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any.
Everything's crystal clear.
It's crystal clear, it looks like. Okay, well, there'll be an opportunity at the end to ask any clarifying questions if you have some. So with that, let's continue. Thank you.
Great. So when I think about what are climate smart large landscape strategies, in my mind, there's 3 really important legs of the stool. And ultimately what we want to shoot for is integrating these 3 kinds of priorities, these 3 kinds of strategies. The first is really understanding how the watershed works, where the water lands and where it goes, and how we can protect the landscape in terms of what I think of as the circulatory system of the landscape in terms of water, and that's like the blood supply of the landscape. Next are habitat corridors, also known as wildlife corridors. You know, where are the places that animals can move through, that also end up also being the ways that plants and other natural resources can move, and how do we keep the landscape connected and permeable so that our natural resources can move through. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about large-scale vegetation management, and you can think of it as forest management, but it's more than forests too, including our grasslands and shrubs, and wildfire mitigation, and how can we innovate new ways to work at larger scales for forest management. So first, strategic watershed protection. This is a picture from a very arid environment, actually Kenya, but I think it's a great example of how where the water flows, life will follow in a particularly arid landscape. This is showing you the drainage network that's formed by the interaction of the history of these mountains and the geology, and then the patterns of rainfall. And this is really a big passion of mine. We call it fluvial geomorphology, the study of how water shapes the surface of the earth. And this is a whole nother talk, but the whole pattern here is driven by different thresholds in the landscape where the water collects, and then it starts to erode and create these beautiful leaf-like or dendritic patterns. So when I see this landscape, I'm thinking about making sure that the circulatory system is intact, and that what we think of as these hydrological connections along these flows is really important. And one of the things that happens when we develop a landscape is sometimes we impact this pattern of flow. This is a great slide that Morgan Gray adapted for us that shows how where the water flows and how the landscape erodes can also create what we call climate refugia. And refugia are places that are relatively cool, and often cool and damp goes together in the landscape. And this can include in the headwaters, snowmelt driven systems, montane wet meadows up there in the valley systems. You can see the connection to groundwater and other water bodies. So seeing this landscape through the lens of climate refugia can help you make sure that you protect those areas that are likely to be the most stable in the future for animals that need those cooler, damper places, and plants, and our water supply. We've done a lot of work in TBC3 to share our knowledge base that includes where the water supply comes from in the landscape. This is a product we did that's called the Bay Area Greenprint, where we shared our data. It was put together by the Nature Conservancy and the Bay Area Open Space Council in connection with Greenbelt Alliance. And so the different shades of blue are important water features, whether the places that water sinks into the ground to recharge our aquifers, floodplains, which are really important for storing water, and stream basins. And again, this data has been used by the Santa Clara Open Space Authority to prioritize which lands to protect. In Sonoma County right now, this information is being used by the Open Space District and the land trusts to prioritize under the auspices of what's called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. We are prioritizing the protection of agricultural and other properties that are in above average in terms of water recharge. So this can really help create a strategy for which lands to protect, particularly in our region and Mediterranean regions where the land is really how we capture the water in rainfall. So remember, we don't use snowmelt in our region. We need the rain, and we need to protect those pieces of land that capture the rain to make sure we have good water. A cool project I learned about working on the Medicos panel is in Cape Town, South Africa, and it's a Nature Conservancy project where they are pursuing strategic watershed protection, and in particular, pulling out these invasive plants that suck up water. And by doing the invasive by targeting the invasive species control in places that have a high recharge value, they're capturing 55 billion gallons of water every year that would otherwise be moving out of the area. And I love this project because I think it shows the example. This is about the city of Cape Town's water supply, but it's really the whole natural area and greenbelt around the city and the river system that's coming in that supplies that water. So it really emphasizes the importance of what I think of as blue and green infrastructure for our urban areas. And if you think about all the cities of the Bay Area, they similarly are relying on the natural and protected lands around them for key resources like water. So how can we increase the adaptation capacity of our cities by protecting our water supplies, and how are we connected? I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat corridors. Again, I think the easiest way to think about them is helping to improve the ability for this guy to be able to maintain his range, move through the landscape, and have enough habitat that he doesn't come into your backyard looking for dinner. We've had two great presentations by my colleague Morgan Gray, who's Pepperwood's conservation analyst, I should say Dr. Morgan Gray. This work was part of what she did her thesis on, and the first project that she did with Pepperwood was to look at what we call the Mayacamas to Berryessa region. So again, you can see the San Francisco Bay at the bottom of this map, this big gray area is the Blue Ridge Berryessa National Monument. And Morgan has effectively mapped all the habitat corridors between the protected areas of this landscape, which are the gray blobs, and then quantified what is the climate adaptation benefit of that connection in terms of how much cooler the animals could get by moving through this landscape. I will say right now, today, a lot of this landscape is on fire. And so the analysis that we're doing right now is super important in terms of understanding the functionality of these corridors in a fire regime. And here are the specific talks that you can see on our YouTube channel. I can't recommend them highly enough. They get both into the science of how we're quantifying wildlife populations on the landscape and then how we're relating that to the climate connectivity in the landscape. As part of our international collaborations, we've shared these methods with our partners in other Mediterranean regions, including in Chile. And so in the Santiago area, there's a habitat corridor project. They call it the El Boldo de Cantillana Habitat Corridor, pursued by our friends at the Fundación Tierra Austral. Tierra Austral is the first land trust in Chile. About 4 or 5 years ago, Chile amended its constitution to create a right of nature, which was the legal foundation needed to be able to do conservation easements. In a constitutional, their constitutional system required that to be able to move forward. So this is the first group trying to use conservation easements and expand protected areas in Chile. And they are really excited to be learning about the methods Pepperwood is doing. And they have a very similar scenario where they have very rare natural areas that have the least amount of protection compared to other areas. And you might have been reading in the news about how there are 11 million acres of new parks in Chile. Most of those are in Patagonia. Patagonia has a lot of emphasis on habitat conservation, but not so much in this area. So very similar patterns to California. And we actually were able to make a connection between Tierra Austral and the research group at Universidad Católica, the Pliskov lab. And so they took the climate space analyses and this approach that we've been using and looked at future scenarios to understand the relationship of their rare species, especially plant species, to future climate change and where those plants might be the most threatened. So they are prioritizing land within this corridor in the context of change and ensuring that they are protecting climate refugia as part of their protection strategy, because they're going to be going to private landowners to ask them to participate in this easement program to connect these lands. I'll also say, you know, once we map these corridors, there's a lot of opportunities to actually increase or restore habitat connectivity. And here's one of the most dramatic examples where a land bridge was built in Catalonia, or I should say, I think this is Western Spain, so that animals can cross roads. And if you hear Morgan's talk, you'll hear about how roads are one of the most challenging interruptions or sources of fragmentation in the landscape. And there's other ways too, through habitat restoration, et cetera, that tie into the next part of the talk. Okay, so multi-parcel vegetation management and wildfire mitigation. When I first got into the field of ecological restoration, we were very much focused on the kind of scenarios you see. This is a Southwest Australia example. On the left-hand side, where the landscape was denuded, vegetation was cleared. This was, I think, a mining operation. And then you work, oh, look, my battery's getting low. I'm back. So you figure out what species composition is appropriate and how to propagate those species either through planting or natural succession, and you restore the landscape by planting more trees. But the challenge is in many Mediterranean ecosystems, I'd say most, forests are what we call overstocked due to fire suppression. Because we've prevented fires from happening, there can be a lot of undergrowth in the understory of these forests. And if you look at the slide I have up here right now, this is an example at Pepperwood on the right-hand side where you see a lot of bushy Douglas fir coming in the understory. These are what we call during wildfire conditions ladder fuels, because the fire can burn up those little Doug fir trees and get into the top of this oak woodland. On the left-hand side, we've taken those trees out, working with our volunteers and our partners. And this creates a much more resilient forest. The oaks are very fire resilient. And so we basically reduce the threat and potential rate and spread of a fire through these methods. And then the other method that we've been really promoting at Pepperwood and our partners around the globe are also pointing out is prescribed fire. So here's an example from one of our Spanish partners. But either manually thinning the forest or using prescribed fire can have multiple benefits, not just reducing the risk of fire, but actually restoring the ecosystem and allowing for more biodiversity by creating more variable landscape features. Of course, in California, as well as Australia and elsewhere, these were part of the indigenous toolkit for land stewardship. So we're really lucky to have a Native Advisory Council and now Clint McKay on our staff to integrate what we're learning scientifically, but harken back to those well-proven stewardship methods that come from our indigenous partners. So Pepperwood's been working really hard building on the TBC3 knowledge base and then partnering with Mark Tuckman of Tuckman Geospatial, who's really an expert on high resolution vegetation mapping. We are using high-tech tools to do this, lasers mounted on airplanes and satellites, as well as ground-based surveys. And what we've created here is a map of the fuels in Sonoma County. And this map predicts what will burn fast, what will burn slow, and what will burn hot, and what will burn a little bit cooler. So right now we're working with both private landowners and the County of Sonoma to translate this into a map of wildfire risks that can be used to prioritize our preparedness and response actions moving forward. We shared this approach with another partner based in Catalonia, the Xarxa para la Conservación de la Natura. Sorry, my Spanish is rusty. But this is a very interesting partnership for us because Catalonia, which I'm showing in the center here, is almost the mirror image of Sonoma County, which is on the right. We're about the same size, and they are similarly tackling this strategy of how can they coordinate the public lands, parks, etc., with a new wave of land conservation on private lands, largely agricultural lands, and integrate with that a strategy for fire resilience. I was there in 2019. 2 days after I arrived, a major wildfire broke out in Catalonia, created air quality issues like we're having right now. And they're partnering with a group called the Pau de Costa Foundation, which is really based in Spain, but now working worldwide as a knowledge exchange for fire prevention in Mediterranean landscapes. I'll just say that in some of our adaptation work, we worked, again, this is the North Coast Resource Partnership geography with Sonoma County and Russian River Basin at the bottom, and then the counties stretching up to the Oregon border. And we did an assessment working with one of our TBC3 founding partners, Jim Thorne, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, of where are forests likely to be vulnerable to climate change impacts, to be drought stressed or possibly have species conversion to new kinds of species, with the red being more exposed than the blue. And we also translated that into probability of fire over 30-year periods and showing the trajectory of fire hazards in the North Coast Resource Partnership area. And you can see they're quite concentrated in our southern part of this region, areas that are burning right now. And I'm really excited to say that we've been funded by the North Coast Resource Partnership. This is a new project that's in the works, and we will be part of the outreach team for this partnership with the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, who have been incredible leaders in landscape scale fire resilience planning and engaging Native and non-Native communities in land stewardship on public lands up north. And Oregon State University, which has developed an algorithm for mapping where fire breaks should go in this landscape. So you're seeing a subset area where they've mapped yellow lines. These yellow lines are intended to be long-term fire breaks that are managed across jurisdictions, and they're called pods, potential operational wildfire delineation areas, AKA where do we have a chance of containing a wildfire. So the project here will be to take the data inputs that we've provided along with new data sources and to create a map like this for the entire NCRP that could be a multi-county strategy for fire containment. So I want to sort of wrap up, and there's so much more I could say on this. In fact, I imagine we'll have a Discover Nature lecture specifically on this corridor at some point. But on the left-hand side, you're seeing a map of our Mayacamas to Berryessa Habitat Corridor Assessment Area. We identified 6 or 7 really important connections that you can see with the hearts on them that link our coastal areas to more inland areas and are just critical for climate adaptation. One of the ones closest to us is what we call the Knights Valley Habitat Corridor. You can see Pepperwood down here in the green. And then our partners that are run by Audubon Canyon Ranch at the Modini Mayacamas Preserves up here. And we've got just an incredibly exciting opportunity because for nearly a decade, we have been monitoring wildlife on both ends of this landscape at Modini and here. And we have a lot of questions and opportunities to better understand wildlife movement through this corridor. And we also have a bunch of terrific partners in terms of our neighbors, many of whom are agricultural operators or rural residents who are very thirsty to understand how can they do all the 3 things we talked about today. How can we protect our water supply, our creeks, and our aquifers? How can we create opportunities for the wildlife that we love to move through the landscape? And how can we overlay that whole system with a vegetation management overlay that allows us to manage the forest in an intelligent way and make us more resilient to these wildfire events that we're becoming more knowledgeable about over time. So with that, I'm gonna take a break and give you a chance to sink in, but we're really excited about partnering with our neighbors to make this wildlife corridor reality. So just to sum up, what's one of the biggest challenges? This world is getting more dynamic than we ever imagined and changing at a faster pace than I could have projected. Sometimes I joke that like scientists really like being right, but after spending 10 years on developing these climate projections and then seeing them all come to pass on a much faster scale than we might have hypothesized, now we're ready to assist with climate adaptation on a day-to-day basis. But I'll just say we're going to need real-time data, the kind of data that our Sentinel site collects, combined with large-scale thinking. So I just want to thank everyone for giving me this chance to get out of day-to-day emergencies for the moment and take that moment to step back and share with you our perspective on looking at a larger scale, both in terms of time and space, so that we can craft really enduring solutions. Thank you.